The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and old textbooks, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you've left. It was a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, and the sun slanted through the windows of Lincoln High, painting golden bars across the scuffed linoleum floor. The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of pencils and the occasional cough. Ms. Hargrove, the math teacher, stood at the front, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line as she scanned the room. She was in her late 40s, with sharp cheekbones and a habit of tapping her foot when she was impatient, which was often. In the third row, near the window, sat Jamal Carter. He was 16, lanky, with a fade haircut and a faded Lakers hoodie. He wore almost every day. Jamal wasn't the loudest kid in class, but he wasn't invisible either. He had a quick laugh, a knack for basketball, and a way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard that made you believe he was unraveling the universe in his mind. Math wasn't his favorite subject, but he got by. Mostly B's, sometimes a C if he didn't study. He wasn't a troublemaker, but Ms. Hargrove always seemed to have her eyes on him, like she was waiting for him to slip up. Today, though, something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence sharper. The class was working through a set of algebra problems, basic stuff about solving for x. Jamal's pencil moved steadily, his brow furrowed as he checked his work. He was almost done when Ms. Hargrove's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "Carter," she said, her tone clipped. Everyone looked up. Jamal's pencil stopped mid-stroke. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but cautious. He tilted his head, waiting. Ms. Hargrove walked to her desk, picked up a piece of chalk, and turned to the board. "Since you're so focused today," she said, her words dripping with something that wasn't quite kindness, "let's see how you handle something a little more advanced." She began writing, her hand moving fast, the chalk squeaking against the board. The class watched, silent, as a problem took shape. Long, tangled, filled with symbols and exponents that looked like they belonged in a college textbook, not a sophomore math class. Jamal blinked, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of it. The rest of the class shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, others staring at the board like it was written in another language. Ms. Hargrove turned, a small smile tugging at her lips. "This is a calculus problem, Carter, from a senior-level course. Think you can solve it?" Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was a sting in it, a challenge that felt like a trap. The room went still. Jamal felt every pair of eyes on him, like spotlights pinning him in place. His heart thudded, not from fear, but from something else, something hot and restless. He knew what this was. He'd seen that look before, not just from Ms. Hargrove, but from others. The look that said, "Prove you belong here." The look that expected him to fail. "I can try," he said finally, his voice low but clear. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the board. Ms. Hargrove's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Go ahead then, we're all waiting." Jamal stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the board, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against his shoulders. The chalk felt cold in his hand, gritty. He stared at the problem. Derivatives, integrals, a mess of variables that twisted like a maze. He wasn't even sure where to start, but he wasn't about to let her see that. Not her, not the class, not himself. He began writing, slowly at first, his hand unsteady. The room was so quiet he could hear his own breathing, the faint creak of the floorboards under his sneakers. He broke the problem down, step by step, the way his older cousin Marcus had taught him when they'd messed around with math over the summer. Marcus was in college, studying engineering, and he'd always told Jamal, "Math's just a puzzle. Man, you find the pieces, you fit them together." Jamal clung to that now, searching for pieces, any pieces, that made sense. Minutes ticked by. 5. Then 10. The class started to fidget, but Jamal didn't notice. He was deep in it, his mind racing, chasing patterns, testing ideas. He erased a line, rewrote it, erased again. Ms. Hargrove stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something unreadable. Then something clicked. A small piece of the puzzle fell into place. A derivative simplified. A variable isolated. Jamal's hand moved faster. His writing surer. He wasn't certain. He was right, but he was moving, and that was enough. He filled half the board, then 3/4, his thoughts spilling out in loops and arrows and numbers. The class was whispering now, not mocking, but curious, like they were seeing something they hadn't expected. Jamal stepped back, chalk dust on his fingers, and looked at his work. It wasn't perfect. He knew that. There were gaps, places, where he'd guessed or fumbled, but it was something. He turned to Ms. Hargrove, his chest tight, and said, "That's what I got." Her eyes flicked to the board, scanning his work. The room waited, holding its breath. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she nodded, just once, and said, "Sit down, Carter." Her voice was flat, but there was a crack in it, a hint of something she hadn't meant to show, surprise maybe, or irritation. Jamal walked back to his seat, his heart still pounding. The class erupted into murmurs, some kids leaning over to whisper to their friends, others stealing glances at him. Ms. Hargrove cleared her throat, sharp and commanding, and the noise died down. "Back to work," she said, turning to erase the board. But Jamal caught it. The way her hand lingered. The way her eyes darted over his equations one last time before she wiped them away. The rest of the period passed in a blur. When the bell rang, kids spilled into the hallway, their voices loud and chaotic, but Jamal stayed at his desk, packing his bag slowly. He felt different. Not triumphant, not exactly, but like something had shifted inside him, like a door had cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light through. He didn't know it yet, but that moment at the board wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The next day, Jamal walked into math class braced for something. Another jab from Ms. Hargrove, maybe, or awkward stares from his classmates. But nothing happened. Ms. Hargrove barely looked at him, her voice droning through a lesson on quadratic. Equations like yesterday had been erased along with the board. The other kids didn't say much either, though a couple nodded at him in the hallway, a quiet kind of respect that felt new. Still, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He kept replaying the moment at the board, the way the chalk had felt, the way the problem had started to unravel under his hands. He wasn't a math genius. Hell, he'd barely passed geometry last year. But there was something about that problem, that challenge, that had hooked him. It wasn't just about proving Ms. Hargrove wrong. It was about proving something to himself. That night, he dug out an old notebook and started messing around with math again, the way he had with Marcus. He didn't have a calculus textbook, so he went online, finding free lessons and videos, piecing things together. He stayed up late, his desk lamp casting a warm glow over pages filled with scribbled equations. It wasn't easy. Half the time, he felt like he was drowning in symbols. But every time he solved something, even a small piece, it was like hitting a perfect jump shot, that clean, satisfying swish. Weeks passed, and Jamal kept at it, quietly, secretly. He didn't tell anyone, not even Marcus, who'd probably laugh and call him a nerd. School went on as usual. Homework, basketball practice, hanging out with his friends. But math became something else. A private world where he could wrestle with problems and come out stronger. Ms. Hargrove didn't single him out again, but Jamal noticed things. The way she'd glance at him when he answered a question in class. The way her tone softened just a fraction when she called on him. It wasn't friendliness, but it was something. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. Then came the day of the midterm. The test was brutal. Page after page of equations, word problems, graphs. Jamal worked through it methodically, his pencil moving with a rhythm he hadn't had before. He finished early, checked his work twice, and handed it in with a quiet confidence that surprised even him. A week later, Ms. Hargrove passed back the tests. She moved through the room, dropping papers on desks with quick, clipped comments. "Good job, needs work, see me after class." When she reached Jamal, she paused, just for a second, and set his test down without a word. He looked at the grade, 92, an A-, his best score ever. But it wasn't the grade that caught his eye. At the bottom of the last page, in Ms. Hargrove's neat handwriting, was a note. "Keep pushing, Carter. You've got potential." Jamal stared at the words, his throat tight. Potential. He'd heard that before, from his mom, from Marcus, from his coach, but coming from Ms. Hargrove, it hit different. It wasn't an apology for that day at the board, not exactly, but it was close. It was acknowledgement. It was proof that he'd made her see him, really see him, not as a kid to trip up, but as someone who could rise. He folded the test carefully and slipped it into his bag. That night he didn't tell anyone about the note. He didn't need to. It was his. Something to carry with him, like a key to that door he'd cracked open months ago. But the story doesn't end there, because life doesn't wrap itself up neatly. Not for Jamal, not for anyone. The next semester brought new challenges, harder classes, tougher games, and a growing sense that the world was watching him, waiting for him to choose a path. Math was still his secret weapon, but it wasn't everything. There were moments when he doubted himself, when the weight of expectations, his own, his family's, even Ms. Hargrove's, felt like too much. There were moments when he wondered if that day at the board had been a fluke, a lucky break that didn't mean anything. Then came the math competition. Lincoln High held it every year, a chance for students to show off their skills, maybe even win a scholarship. Jamal hadn't planned to sign up. Competitions weren't his thing. But his friend Tasha overheard him talking about calculus one day and practically dragged him to the sign-up sheet. "You're doing it, Jay," she said, hands on her hips. "Don't even try to argue." He grumbled, but he wrote his name down. The truth was, part of him wanted to. Part of him wanted to see how far he could go. To test himself not against Ms. Hargrove or a grade, but against something bigger. The competition was held in the school auditorium, the air buzzing with nervous energy. Kids from every grade were there, some clutching notebooks, others whispering formulas under their breath. Jamal sat near the back, his hands in his pockets, trying to look calm even though his stomach was twisting. Ms. Hargrove was one of the judges, standing at the front with a clipboard, her face unreadable. The problems were projected on a screen, one after another, each harder than the last. Jamal worked fast, his pencil flying, his mind sharp. He didn't think about winning or losing, just about the problems themselves, the logic, the patterns, the pieces fitting together. By the time the final round came, he was one of 5 students, left standing, the auditorium quiet except for the scratch of pencils and the occasional gasp from the crowd. The last problem was a monster, calculus again, layered with tricks and traps. Jamal attacked it, breaking it down, searching for the thread that would unravel it. He didn't look at the other competitors, didn't look at Miss Hargrove or the clock. It was just him and the problem, the way it had been that day at the board. When time was called, he set his pencil down, his hand aching, his heart racing. The judges collected the papers, and the wait began. Minutes stretched into forever, the auditorium filled with whispers and shifting feet. Jamal kept his eyes on his sneakers, trying not to hope too hard. Finally, Ms. Hargrove stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, professional, but Jamal thought he heard something else in it, something softer. "Third place," she said, reading a name. Then, second place. Another name, not his. He exhaled, bracing himself. It was fine, he told himself. He'd made it this far. That was enough. "And first place," Ms. Hargrove said, pausing just long enough to make his chest tighten. "Jamal Carter." The auditorium erupted, cheers, claps, a few whistles. Jamal blinked, stunned, as Tasha grabbed his arm and shook him, laughing. "Told you," she shouted over the noise. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the front. Ms. Hargrove handed him a certificate, her eyes meeting his for a moment. She didn't smile, but there was something in her gaze, pride maybe, or something close to it. "Well done," she said quietly, and he nodded, unable to find words. He held the certificate. The weight of it sank in. This wasn't just about math, not anymore. It was about everything. Every doubt he'd pushed through, every late night, every time he'd refused to give up. It was about that day at the board, when a joke had become a spark that, had become ascendant, turned into a fire that carried him further than anyone could have predicted. And as he stood there, the applause still ringing in his ears, Jamal knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The door he'd cracked open was wide now, and he was ready to walk through it, wherever it led. The auditorium lights felt too bright, the certificate in Jamal's hands crinkling slightly as his grip tightened. He walked back to his seat, the cheers still echoing, Tasha's grin wide enough to split her face. His heart was doing something strange, part pounding, part soaring, like it couldn't decide whether to race or float. He sat down, the noise around him fading into a hum, and stared at the words on the certificate. First place, Lincoln High math competition. It was real, solid, but it felt like a dream he wasn't ready to wake up from. Tasha nudged him. "You're famous now, Jay," she whispered, her voice teasing but proud. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips, but he didn't say anything. Famous? Nah. He was just Jamal, same as always, except he wasn't. Not entirely. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kids he barely knew clapped him on the shoulder in the hallway. Teachers gave him nods that felt different, weightier. Even Coach Daniels, who usually only cared about Jamal's jump shot, pulled him aside after practice and said, "Heard you're out here winning brain trophies now. Keep it up, Carter." Jamal mumbled a thanks, his face warm, but inside, something was shifting again, like gears grinding into a new pattern. That night, he didn't go straight home. He walked to the park near his house, the one with the busted basketball hoop and the graffiti-covered benches. It was quiet, the air cool, the sky bruising purple as dusk settled in. He sat on a bench, the certificate still in his bag, and pulled out his notebook instead. He flipped to a blank page and started scribbling. Not math this time, but thoughts, fragments, things he couldn't say out loud. Potential. Ms. Hargrove's word kept circling in his head, sharp and heavy, like it was daring him to figure out what it meant. He thought about that day at the board, how it had started as a jab, a joke meant to trip him up. He thought about Ms. Hargrove's face when he'd solved it, or at least come close. He thought about the competition, the way the problem had felt alive under his hands, like it was fighting him but begging to be tamed. And he thought about his mom, who'd be home from her shift at the hospital soon, tired but smiling when he showed her the certificate. She'd hug him, probably cry a little, and tell him he was going places. He wanted to believe her. He was starting to, but there was something else nagging at him, something he couldn't shake. Winning the competition wasn't the end of anything. It was a door, sure, but doors lead to rooms, and rooms have walls, and he didn't know what was waiting on the other side. School was one thing, but the world outside? That was bigger, messier, full of people who'd look at him and see only what they wanted to see. A black kid from a neighborhood like his, not a math champ, not a kid with potential. He'd felt those looks his whole life, and they didn't vanish just because he had a certificate in his bag. Jamal closed the notebook, his fingers tracing the worn edges. He wasn't naive. He knew one win didn't change the game. Not really. But it gave him something. A foothold, a spark. And he wasn't about to let it flicker out. The weeks that followed were strange, like living in two worlds at once. At school, Jamal was still the same guy, cracking jokes with Tasha, stealing fries off his friend Devin's tray, hustling on the court. But math class was different now. Ms. Hargrove didn't call him out anymore, didn't toss him impossible problems as a test. Instead, she started slipping him extra work, quietly, almost secretly. A packet of calculus problems left on his desk after class, a book on number theory with a sticky note that said, "Try chapter 3. No fanfare, no explanation, just expectation. At first, Jamal wasn't sure what to make of it. Was she trying to make up for before? Or was she pushing him, testing him in a new way? He didn't ask. He just took the work and dove in, late. Nights blurring into early mornings, his desk a mess of graph paper and half-empty coffee mugs. The problems were hard, harder than anything in class, but they were alive, each one a puzzle that pulled him deeper. He started to see math differently, not as a subject to pass, but as a language, a way to wrestle with the world and win. His grades climbed, Not just in math, but across the board. His English teacher, Mrs. Rivera, pulled him aside one day and said, "Your essays are sharper lately, Jamal. What's going on with you?" He shrugged, not sure how to explain that solving equations was teaching him to think clearer, to argue better, to see patterns in everything, stories, history, even people. But not everyone saw the change. Some kids started giving him side-eye, muttering things like teacher's pet or math nerd when they thought he couldn't hear. Devin, his best friend since 5th grade, teased him about it too, but it stung more coming from him. "You gonna ditch us for the brainiacs? Now?" Devin said one day at lunch, half laughing but with an edge that made Jamal pause. "Nah, man," Jamal said, forcing a grin. "Just trying to get out of here, you know?" Devin nodded, but something hung between them, a crack that hadn't been there before. Jamal felt it, sharp and cold. But he didn't know how to fix it. He wasn't ditching anyone. But he wasn't standing still either. He couldn't. Not now. Then came the letter. It arrived on a rainy Thursday, tucked in a plain white envelope with the school's logo in the corner. Jamal's mom found it in the mailbox and left it on the kitchen table, her handwriting scrawled across the top. "For my champ." He opened it after dinner, his fingers clumsy, his stomach twisting with a mix of curiosity and dread. It was from Ms. Hargrove, but it wasn't just a note. It was an invitation. A recommendation, really, to apply for a summer program at a university 2 hours away. A STEM camp for high schoolers, focused on math and engineering, fully funded for kids who showed exceptional promise. Ms. Hargrove had written his name in, called him a standout. Said his work in the competition had caught the eye of someone on the judging panel. Someone with connections to the program. Jamal read it twice, then set it down, his hands shaking. A university, a real one, with lecture halls and labs and professors who didn't mess around. It was the kind of thing Marcus talked about, the kind of thing Jamal had always seen as later. Not now. But here it was, staring him in the face, a chance to step through that door and see what was on the other side. His mom was over the moon when he told her. She hugged him so tight he could barely breathe, her voice thick with pride. "This is it, baby," she said. "This is you showing the world what you're made of." But Jamal wasn't so sure. The program was 6 weeks long. Away from home, away from his friends, his team, his life. He'd miss summer league, miss late nights at the park with Tasha and Devin, miss the rhythm of his world. And what if he got there and couldn't keep up? What if the other kids were smarter, richer, better prepared? What if he was just not enough? He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the letter on his nightstand like a weight he could feel across the room. He thought about Ms. Hargrove, about that day at the board, about the competition, about every time he'd pushed through when he wanted to quit. He thought about his mom's tired smile, Marcus's laugh, Tasha's shove when she'd made him sign up. He thought about Devin's words, that crack between them, and wondered if chasing this meant losing something else. By morning, he'd made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one, but it was his. He filled out the application, his pen moving slow but steady, and dropped it in the mailbox before he could change his mind. As the lid clanged shut, he felt it again. That spark, that fire. It wasn't loud or certain, but it was there, burning quiet and fierce. The weeks before the program were a whirlwind. Finals hit hard. Basketball season wrapped up with a tough loss in the playoffs, and Jamal found himself juggling more than he ever had. He kept up with the extra math work, though, carving out time between practice and homework to wrestle with problems that left his brain aching but alive. Ms. Hargrove didn't say much about the program, but she'd nod when he turned in the packets, her eyes sharp with something that looked like approval. The day he left for the university, his mom drove him to the bus station, her hands tight on the steering wheel. She didn't cry, but her voice was soft when she said, "You call me if you need anything, okay? Anything." "I will," Jamal said, his bag slung over his shoulder, the certificate tucked inside like a talisman. The bus ride was long, the world outside blurring into green and gray. When he arrived, the campus was bigger than he'd imagined, sprawling lawns, brick buildings, Kids his age carrying backpacks and confidence he wasn't sure he could match. He felt out of place, his sneakers too worn, his hoodie too faded, but he squared his shoulders and walked into the orientation like he belonged. The program was intense from the jump. Classes every morning, labs in the afternoon, group projects that stretched into the night. The other students were sharp. Some cocky, some quiet, all hungry to prove themselves. Jamal didn't talk much at first, just listened, watched, learned. The math was brutal, a leap from anything he'd done before. But he attacked it like he always had, breaking it down, searching for patterns, refusing to back off. By the second week, he was finding his rhythm. He started speaking up in class, his voice steady, his ideas holding weight. He made a friend, a kid named Leo with a quick laugh and a knack for coding, who'd nudge him when he got too serious and say, "Chill, man, you're killing it." He wasn't killing it, not yet, but he was holding his own, and that was enough. Then came the group project. They were tasked with designing a model, a bridge, a circuit, anything that solved a real-world problem using math and engineering. Jamal's group chose a water filtration system, something simple but practical, inspired by a documentary he'd watched with his mom about clean water shortages. He threw himself into it, sketching designs, running calculations, arguing with his teammates over angles and materials. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and when they presented it to the professors, Jamal stood at the front, his voice clear, his hands steady. The professor, a gray-haired woman with glasses perched on her nose, asked him a question, a tricky one about flow rates and pressure. He paused, his mind racing, and then answered, pulling from a problem he'd solved back in Ms. Hargrove's packet. The Professor nodded, a small smile breaking through her stern expression, and said, "Well thought out, Mr. Carter." That night, Jamal lay in his dorm bunk, staring at the ceiling again. But this time he wasn't wrestling with doubt. He was thinking about the future, not some vague, far-off thing, but something real, something he could shape. Engineering, maybe, or something bigger. Something that could change things for his mom, his neighborhood, his world. He didn't have the answers yet, but he had the questions, and that felt like a start. Back home, the summer ended, and Jamal returned different. Not louder or flashier, but surer, like he'd grown into himself. His mom noticed it first, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the program. Tasha noticed it too, teasing him about his fancy college vibes, but hugging him tight when she thought no one was looking. Even Devin came around, slapping his shoulder and saying, "All right, math star, you still owe me a rematch on the court." Hargrove noticed it most of all. On the first day of junior year, she stopped him after class, her voice quieter than usual. "I heard you did well this summer," she said, her eyes searching his. "I'm not surprised." Jamal nodded, not sure what to say. He didn't thank her, not for the program, not for that day at the board. He didn't need to. They understood, each other in their own way, two people who'd clashed and come out changed. As he walked out of the classroom, the hallway loud with voices and laughter, Jamal felt that fire again, burning brighter now, steady. He didn't know where it would take him, not yet. But he knew he'd follow it, step by step, problem by problem, until he found out. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he could still hear the chalk squeaking against the board, the sound of a challenge that had become a promise. The hallway stretched out before Jamal, a river of noise and motion, kids jostling and shouting as they spilled out of classrooms. He adjusted his backpack, the weight of his books familiar, but lighter somehow, like he was carrying more than just homework now. That fire in his chest wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't need to be. It was steady, a quiet heat that had taken root the day Ms. Hargrove tossed him that impossible problem, the day he'd stood at the board and refused to back down. He stepped. Outside, the September air sharp with the promise of fall. The sky was wide, streaked with clouds that looked like they'd been painted with a heavy hand. Jamal tilted his head, the way he always did when he was thinking hard, and let himself imagine, not just tomorrow or next week, but years from now. A college campus maybe, bigger than the one he'd seen that summer. A lab where he could build something real, something that mattered. A life where he wasn't just getting by, but reaching, climbing, becoming. He didn't have all the pieces. Yet. There'd be more problems to solve, math, sure. But also the kind that didn't fit on a chalkboard. Doubts, setbacks, people who'd look at him and see less than he was. But Jamal knew something now. Something he hadn't known before. That day in Ms. Hargrove's class, he was enough. Not perfect. Not a genius. Just enough to keep going, to keep pushing. To turn a joke into a spark into a fire into a future. As he walked home, his sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk, he thought about his mom waiting with dinner, Tasha's laugh, Marcus's stories, even Miss Hargrove's sharp nod. They were part of this, all of them, woven into the puzzle he was still solving. And for the first time, Jamal felt like the answer wasn't out there somewhere, waiting to be found. It was in him, growing, piece by piece, step by step. He turned. The corner, the park coming into view, that busted hoop still standing like a challenge. He smiled, small and sure, and kept walking. The world was big, but he was ready. Not for everything, not yet, but for whatever came next. And that was enough.